The city of Detroit was restless beneath a winter sky, its cold a biting chill that seeped into bones and lingered in the air like an unwelcome guest. In a small corner behind the Morning Light Cafe, Marcus Washington sat on a flattened cardboard box, his few belongings bundled tightly beside him. His dark skin, weathered by years of service and hardship, bore the harsh marks of countless nights spent in the unforgiving cold. Marcus was a veteran in his late 60s, a man whose years of military service were etched into his face through a hardened jawline and eyes that had seen more than most could imagine. His hands, rough and calloused from years of combat and survival, trembled slightly as he held a small cup of coffee given to him by a passing stranger. This warm cup, a simple kindness, was rare in his world. To everyone else on Woodward Avenue, Marcus was invisible, just another shadow in the background of their busy lives. They hurried past, averting their eyes, some clutching their bags tighter when they noticed his presence. But Marcus hadn't always been invisible. Once, he was Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington, a leader, a protector, someone people looked up to. He had commanded respect, led missions, and saved lives. Yet somewhere between battles on foreign soil and struggles within his own mind, his life had taken a dark turn. After returning home from his third tour, the civilian world, once familiar, seemed alien. His friends had moved on, his family grew distant, and the security job he was promised at Highland Industries fell through. Another broken promise in a long line of disappointments that seemed to follow veterans of color. If you're finding this story moving, consider subscribing to support more content that sheds light on the real struggles of our veterans. The days blurred together, each one colder and harsher than the last. Marcus had learned to survive on little, rationing meals from shelters and finding solace in the few moments of humanity extended to him. He developed a routine of sorts, moving between different spots in the city, careful not to stay too long in any one place. Experience had taught him that his presence often made people uncomfortable, whether due to his homelessness, his race, or both. One such moment of kindness came from Maria, the assistant manager at the Morning Light, who occasionally handed him leftover pastries and coffee. She reminded him of his younger sister, Rachel, whom he hadn't spoken to in years. However, that fragile kindness was shattered one cold evening when the cafe's owner, concerned about the establishment's image in the rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, made a call to the police. Minutes later, 2 patrol cars pulled up, their lights casting harsh shadows across the brick walls. Officer Reynolds stepped out, his expression stern but not unkind. His partner, Officer Chun, hung back, hand resting casually on his belt. "Sir, you can't stay here," Officer Reynolds said, his voice firm but carrying a note of resignation. "We've received complaints about trespassing." Marcus didn't argue. Years of discipline and the weight of countless similar encounters had taught him to follow orders without question. Quietly, he gathered his few possessions: a worn military backpack containing his DD-214, a faded photograph of his unit, and a thin blanket donated by the Veterans Outreach Center. As he stood, his joints protesting against the cold, Officer Reynolds grabbed his arm. The touch was light, but it sent a jolt of tension through Marcus's body, memories of past confrontations flashing through his mind. "I'm sorry, sir, but we need to take you in," Officer Reynolds added, his tone softer but resolute. "There have been multiple complaints from business owners in the area." Marcus's heart sank. He'd hoped, just this once, to be left in peace. Instead, he found himself being led to the patrol car, acutely aware of the gathering crowd of onlookers, their phones raised to capture another moment of public drama. Some whispered among themselves, their judgments clear in their expressions, while others simply watched with detached curiosity. At the precinct, Marcus was booked for trespassing. Sitting in the corner of the holding cell, the steel of the bench pressed coldly into his bones. His mind felt numb as he thought about the thousands of nights he had spent like this, alone, forgotten, and unwanted. When the officers gave him a date for a court hearing, Marcus nodded, his voice a mere whisper as he agreed to appear. Deep down, he wondered if it even mattered anymore. As they processed his paperwork, a young desk sergeant glanced at his file, then did a double-take at his service record. The sergeant's expression shifted from routine indifference to something approaching shame, but like so many others before him, he simply processed the papers and moved on. Before releasing him into the cold night, Officer Reynolds pulled him aside. "Look, Mr. Washington, there are programs for veterans," he said, handing him a crumpled resource pamphlet. "You shouldn't be out here like this." Marcus took the pamphlet with trembling hands, adding it to his collection of similar well-meaning but ultimately ineffective offerings. He tried many of these programs before, but the waiting lists were long, the paperwork overwhelming, and the system seemed designed to wear down even the most determined souls. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to subscribe. Your support helps us continue sharing these important narratives that often go untold. As Marcus stepped back into the night, the city's lights blurred through his tears. Tomorrow, he would need to find a new spot, face new challenges, and continue his invisible battle for survival. But tonight, under the indifferent glow of streetlights, he allowed himself to remember who he once was: a proud soldier, a brother, a man who had fought for a country that now seemed to have no place for him. Little did Marcus know, his life was about to change dramatically, though whether for better or worse remained to be seen. The approaching court date loomed like a storm on the horizon, carrying with it the potential for either further hardship or unexpected salvation. On the day of his hearing, Marcus Washington walked into the Wayne County Courthouse with his head held low, his shoulders bearing the weight of countless disappointments. The marble halls echoed with footsteps and whispered conversations, each sound amplifying his sense of displacement in this formal setting. He wore a mismatched suit jacket donated from the First Baptist Church shelter and a pair of shoes that pinched his toes, painful reminders of his current circumstances. His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them in front of him, waiting for his name to be called. The courthouse corridor was filled with the usual morning bustle: lawyers in crisp suits hurrying past with briefcases, clerks shuffling papers, and other defendants waiting their turn before justice. Marcus noticed how people gave him a wide berth, their eyes sliding past him as if he were a shadow on the wall. If you're captivated by Marcus's story, consider subscribing to support more narratives that shine a light on the overlooked corners of our society. The courtroom itself was an imposing space, with its high ceilings and dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb both light and hope. Marcus took a seat in the back row, trying to make himself invisible, a skill he had perfected over years on the streets. The room was filled with whispered judgments and curious glances from the other attendees. In their eyes, he was just another homeless man who had likely made a mess of his life. The bailiff's voice rang out, commanding everyone to rise as Judge Gabriela Martinez entered the courtroom. She was a distinguished woman in her mid-50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing and a presence that commanded respect. As she took her seat, Marcus noticed how she surveyed the room with careful attention, as if reading the stories written on each face before her. The proceedings began with their usual formality, a parade of minor offenses, traffic violations, and petty crimes. Marcus listened as each case was called, watching how differently the judge treated each defendant. Some received stern lectures, others understanding nods, but all were treated with a baseline of respect that surprised him. Finally, the bailiff called out, "Case number 2347, City of Detroit versus Marcus Washington, charged with criminal trespassing." Marcus rose slowly, his joints stiff from sitting too long in the cold courtroom. As he made his way to the defendant's table, he could feel the weight of every eye in the room. The public defender assigned to his case, a young woman named Rebecca Chen, barely looked up from her stack of files as he approached. Judge Martinez began reading through his file, her expression neutral and professional. But something caught her attention, causing her voice to trail off as she paused, reading over a line a second time. Her eyes narrowed, and she looked up, studying Marcus with sudden intensity. "Mr. Washington," she began, her voice carrying a note of recognition that made Marcus's heart skip a beat. "Your file indicates you served in the 82nd Airborne Division. Is that correct?" The room grew quiet, the usual shuffle of papers and whispered conversations falling silent as everyone listened intently. Marcus straightened slightly, military bearing returning to his posture almost unconsciously. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "I served with the 82nd for 22 years. Judge Martinez removed her reading glasses, her expression softening. "Mr. Washington, were you stationed at Fort Bragg in 1991? Specifically with the 2nd Battalion?" Marcus's eyes widened, memories flooding back with unexpected force. "Yes, Your Honor. I was a staff sergeant with the 2nd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment." The judge leaned forward, emotion clearly visible on her face now. "Mr. Washington, my brother served in that same battalion. He often told us stories about a staff sergeant who saved not just his life, but the lives of their entire squad during Operation Desert Storm. A man who carried a wounded soldier through enemy territory for 3 miles after their unit was ambushed." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the atmosphere shifted palpably. Marcus felt his throat tighten as the memories of that day rushed back, the searing heat, the weight of his wounded comrade, the endless trek through hostile territory. If this story moves you, take a moment to subscribe and support our mission to bring these powerful veteran stories to light. "That was Private James Martinez," Marcus said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "He had been hit in the leg by sniper fire. I couldn't leave him behind." He paused, swallowing hard. "How is your brother, Your Honor?" Judge Martinez's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "James passed away 5 years ago from cancer, but he never forgot what you did. He named his son Marcus, in your honor." The courtroom was completely silent now, the earlier judgments replaced by a collective sense of shame and recognition. The same people who had earlier avoided looking at Marcus now couldn't take their eyes off him, seeing for the first time the hero who had been invisible among them. Judge Martinez composed herself, though her voice still carried the weight of emotion. "Mr. Washington, my brother spoke of you often. He said you were the finest soldier he'd ever known. A man who led by example, who never left anyone behind, who showed extraordinary courage under the most challenging circumstances." She paused, looking down at the charges before her. "And yet here you stand today, facing charges for simply trying to find shelter in the country you served so honorably." The judge turned to address the courtroom, her voice ringing with authority and barely contained anger. "This man before us served our country with distinction for over 2 decades. He risked his life countless times, saved numerous American lives, and earned every medal that our nation can bestow upon its heroes. And how have we repaid him? By allowing him to fall through the cracks, by criminalizing his poverty, by turning a blind eye to his struggles." She turned back to Marcus, her expression softening once again. "Mr. Washington, I am not only dismissing these charges, I am ordering an immediate investigation into why you haven't received the veterans' benefits you're entitled to. Furthermore, I'm ordering the court's Veterans Advocacy Program to provide you with immediate assistance." The public defender, Ms. Chun, who had been frantically taking notes, spoke up. "Your Honor, I can personally ensure Mr. Washington is connected with the appropriate services today." Judge Martinez nodded approvingly before continuing. "Mr. Washington, my brother often said that you taught him the true meaning of leave no man behind. It's time for us to live up to that principle. This court stands adjourned for a 30-minute recess." As the judge rose to leave, the entire courtroom stood, but this time it wasn't just protocol. It was respect. Marcus remained standing, tears streaming down his face, as several veterans in the gallery approached him, offering handshakes and words of support. The Invisible Man had suddenly become the center of attention, but for the first time in years, the attention didn't feel like judgment. It felt like recognition. If Marcus's story has touched your heart, please subscribe to ensure more veteran stories like his reach the audiences they deserve. But this was only the beginning of Marcus Washington's journey back from the brink. The system that had failed him was about to face its own reckoning, and Marcus would soon find himself at the center of a movement much bigger than himself. The days following the courtroom hearing brought a whirlwind of changes to Marcus Washington's life. Rebecca Chun, the public defender who had barely acknowledged him during the hearing, now worked tirelessly to connect him with veteran services. She discovered that his benefits application had been lost in a bureaucratic maze years ago, buried under mountains of paperwork and systemic inefficiencies that disproportionately affected veterans of color. If you're invested in Marcus's journey, please subscribe to support more stories that expose the challenges facing our veterans. Within days, Marcus found himself at the Detroit Veterans Support Center, a modern facility that stood in stark contrast to the streets he had called home. The intake specialist, a young veteran named David Thompson, listened to his story with genuine interest, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he documented years of neglect and missed opportunities for intervention. "Mr. Washington," David said, looking up from his computer with determination in his eyes. "What happened to you should never have happened to any veteran, let alone someone with your distinguished service record. We're going to make this right." The process began immediately. The center provided Marcus with temporary housing at the Veterans Haven, a transitional facility in a renovated hotel. For the first time in years, he had a real bed, a private bathroom, and 3 meals a day. But more importantly, he had access to the medical and mental health care he desperately needed. Dr. Angela Roberts, the center's chief psychiatrist, specialized in treating veterans with PTSD and combat-related trauma. During their first session, she created a safe space for Marcus to finally confront the demons he'd been carrying since Desert Storm. "You've been fighting 2 wars, Sergeant Washington," she said gently. "The one overseas and the one within yourself. It's time to find peace on both fronts." If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing to help us continue sharing these powerful narratives of healing and redemption. The physical transformation was remarkable. With proper nutrition and medical care, Marcus began to regain his strength. The tremor in his hands steadied, and the perpetual hunger that had gnawed at him for years finally subsided. The center's clothing bank provided him with properly fitting clothes, restoring a dignity he had almost forgotten. But it was the psychological transformation that proved most profound. In group therapy sessions, Marcus met other veterans who shared similar stories, men and women who had served their country proudly only to find themselves struggling to survive in civilian life. Among them was James Cooper, another African-American veteran who had served in Afghanistan. "Man, they train us for everything except coming home," James said during one session, his words striking a chord with everyone present. "They teach us how to fight, how to survive in combat, but nobody tells you how to survive the silence when it's all over." Marcus found himself nodding, understanding exactly what James meant. The camaraderie in these sessions reminded him of the brotherhood he'd known in the service, and slowly, he began to open up about his own experiences. If you find value in these stories of veteran resilience, please subscribe to support our mission. As weeks turned into months, Marcus's progress caught the attention of the center's administration. They offered him a position as a peer counselor, recognizing that his experience could help other veterans navigate the challenging transition to civilian life. For the first time in years, Marcus had a purpose again, a way to serve that didn't involve combat. His first assigned case was a young Marine named Michael Rodriguez, recently returned from his 3rd tour in the Middle East. Michael was struggling with many of the same issues Marcus had faced: alienation, depression, and the overwhelming feeling of being lost in a world that no longer made sense. "I don't know how to be normal anymore," Michael confessed during their first meeting. "Everything feels wrong here. Too quiet, too peaceful. I keep waiting for something to explode." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes meeting Michael's with understanding. "Brother, there's no such thing as normal after what we've seen. But there is a way forward. Let me show you how to find it." The success with Michael led to more referrals, and soon Marcus was running his own support group for combat veterans. He had a particular way of connecting with younger veterans of color, understanding their unique struggles in a system that often seemed stacked against them. If you believe in the power of veterans helping veterans, please subscribe to support our continuing coverage of these important stories. One day, as Marcus walked past the Morning Light Cafe, Maria, the assistant manager who had once shown him kindness, spotted him through the window. She rushed outside, tears in her eyes, and embraced him. "Mr. Washington, I'm so sorry," she began, but Marcus gently interrupted her. "There's nothing to be sorry for," he said with a warm smile. Sometimes we have to hit rock bottom before we can find our way back up. The cafe's owner, who had called the police on him months ago, watched this interaction from inside, shame evident on his face. The next day, he contacted the Veterans Support Center, offering to provide job training and employment opportunities for veterans in transition. Marcus's story began to spread throughout Detroit, catching the attention of local media. The Detroit Free Press ran a feature article titled "From Streets to Service: One Veteran's Journey Back," highlighting not just Marcus's personal transformation but the systemic issues facing veterans of color. State Senator Eleanor Thompson read the article and invited Marcus to testify before the state legislature about veteran homelessness and the unique challenges faced by veterans of color. Standing at the podium, Marcus spoke with the same quiet authority that had once commanded troops in combat. "The real tragedy," he testified, "isn't just that veterans end up on the streets. It's that we let them become invisible. We train them to be heroes, then treat them like ghosts when they come home. And for veterans of color, that invisibility is often doubled by racial bias and systemic inequities." If you believe in the power of truth to create change, please subscribe to support more investigative stories like this one. His testimony led to the passage of the Veterans Dignity Act, which increased funding for veteran support services and mandated better tracking and outreach for at-risk veterans, with specific provisions addressing racial disparities in veteran services. A year after the courtroom hearing that changed his life, Marcus stood before a different audience, a graduation ceremony at the Veterans Haven. As the keynote speaker, he addressed a group of veterans completing their transition program. "When I was on the streets," he began, his voice strong and clear, "I used to think I was alone, but I wasn't alone. I was just invisible. And there are still too many invisible veterans out there, fighting battles we can't see, carrying wounds we don't understand. Our mission now is to make sure no veteran remains invisible." The applause that followed was thunderous, but it was the tears in the eyes of the graduating veterans that told the real story. They saw in Marcus not just a success story, but a roadmap for their own journeys. If you're moved by stories of transformation and hope, please subscribe to support our ongoing coverage of veteran issues. Today, Marcus Washington lives in a modest apartment near the Veterans Support Center, where he continues to work as a senior peer counselor. His walls are decorated with his military commendations, finally rescued from the storage unit he couldn't afford for so many years. Among them hangs a new photograph, one of him with Judge Martinez at the opening of the James Martinez Veterans Advocacy Center, a facility specifically dedicated to helping homeless veterans navigate the legal system. Each morning, Marcus starts his day by reading letters from veterans he's helped, reminding himself that every life touched is a battle won. He keeps Judge Martinez's brother's dog tags on his desk, a gift from the judge that serves as a constant reminder of the bonds that connect all veterans. But perhaps the most meaningful item in his apartment is a simple coffee cup from the Morning Light Cafe, now part of a citywide network of veteran-friendly businesses. It reminds him of how far he's come, and more importantly, of how many others still need help finding their way home. As this story comes to a close, remember that for every Marcus Washington whose story we know, there are thousands of other veterans still waiting to be seen, still needing our help to find their way back. Their stories deserve to be heard, their service honored, and their struggles acknowledged. If you believe in the power of storytelling to change lives, please subscribe to our channel. Together, we can ensure that no veteran's story goes untold, and no hero remains invisible. The end of Marcus's story is really just the beginning, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and a reminder that it's never too late for justice, redemption, and the restoration of dignity. His journey from the shadows of society to the forefront of veteran advocacy continues to inspire and challenge us all to do better, to see the invisible, and to leave no one behind.